Sorry, I'm in your way, Chrissy.
Hi everybody. I'm just gonna let you know that it is past, and I've let the Zoom audience in. So I know that Brisbane is experiencing extremes of weather at the moment, and so therefore it may take a little bit to get all of the people who are booked for the event in. But I think that because the Zoom audience are entering the room at the moment, we might just start to look a little bit more formal. I'll leave that on for you. Sure. Right, and I'll take this off and talk to the people. So hello everybody. I'm using my fishwife voice so that I don't COVID up the microphones. Just letting you know a couple of things before we get started. One of the things is that if you have your mobile phone with you, switch it to silent so that it doesn't go off in the middle of the event. That'd be great. And also that the toilets go that way and then up the stairs, which are hidden, and they're just behind the counter there. So upstairs is where the toilets are. So that's, if you need that, that's where to go. And also the book is front and centre at the counter. So if you do want to purchase a book, it's front and centre at the counter. For those people at home, you can purchase online. You can also either after the event, we'll turn the phones back on, and you could call and then we could sell you the book and get it personally signed to you. So that's something that we could do. If you buy it online, we can get you a signed copy, but and we can actually probably still get it personally signed because Warren will be back tomorrow to do a soiree with us. So I'm pretty sure he can hang around and do some books as well. So if you want it personally signed, let us know and just purchase that online. And we're going to send you the link. So you'll see in the chat function where the link is to purchase the book. And if you click on that, that's where you can purchase the book. So without further ado, I think we might get started. We do know that there are people who are still going to come and are going to arrive very wet and very late, but we will just bear with the weather on that one. I hope that everybody who is watching from home is safe and sound. I know quite a few people got flooded in, and that's why you're watching on Zoom tonight. So sorry about that, and it's a shame that you can't join us in real life. But without further ado, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on. In this area, it's the Yagara and the Turrbal people, and I'd like to pay my deepest respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any other elders who are here tonight. I'd also like to pay my respects to the elders of the lands that you are zooming in from as well. If you're zooming in from Australia, you'll be zooming in from Aboriginal lands, because this always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and that sovereignty was never ceded. So here we are on stolen land, launching a wonderful book, which has been a long time in the making. And I'm very, very proud that we get to launch it, because I did see the glimmer of this book in Warren's eye many, many years ago. And I really believed that this moment would come, and I knew that it would. And it is finally here, and it's really exciting to be launching it. But I will do an official introduction for Warren for you. Warren Ward is Associate Professor of Psychiatry at the University of Queensland. His writing has appeared in New Philosopher, Eon, Overland, Prairie Fire, Bjelke Blues, Great Walks, Writing Queensland, Soft Copy, Our Inside Voices and the Stardust Review. The manuscript for lovers of philosophy was shortlisted or selected for several awards, programs and residencies, including the Hazel Rowley Literary Award, Queensland Writers Centre, Hachette Australia Manuscript Development Program, Hard Copy Professional Development Program for Emerging Writers, Catherine Susanna Pritchard's Writers Centre Residency Program, Yale Writers Conference, Vermont Studio Centre, Zanzirat International Art Residency in Barcelona, and Artella's Creative Centre in Finland. And I am incredibly jealous of that list, I have to tell you. And a lot of this must have been pre-COVID, as we can imagine, because COVID would have stopped a lot of that happening. But in 2018, Warren was awarded a scholarship for the Disquiet International Literary Program in Lisbon as well. In 2020, the manuscript was shortlisted for the Varuna Publishing Internship Program and won an Australian Society of Authors Mentorship Award. In 2021, Warren was awarded a Varuna Residential Fellowship and shortlisted in the inaugural Varuna New Zealand International Residency Exchange. His essays on philosophy, culture and history of ideas have been shortlisted for the New Philosophers Writing Award 12 times, and he won the award in 2016 and 2019. You can see the pedigree that Warren brings to this work and the fact that this work has always been destined to be published. He was recently awarded an Artist-in-Residence Denis Diderot AIR grant at the Château d'Auveux in France. I am terrible.
I can't pronounce that either.
Something unpronounceable in France. So everybody, it's very exciting to welcome a brand new writer to, well, not really brand new, but a brand new published writer to the Brisbane literary world, Warren Ward. And in conversation with Warren today, we have Anni Webster-Wright, who's a writer, philosopher and poet with a teaching and research background in academia. Her work explores how people find meaning in life, which is the perfect way of starting this conversation, I think. So everybody welcome Anni.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'd also like to pay my respects to the Yagara and Turrbal people as the first storytellers of this land and the first philosophers of this land, the people from whom we still have so much to learn. Warren, I am so excited. I'm thrilled to actually be here tonight. And I have so much, I've seen, like, as Chrissy did, I've seen the writing in this book for quite some time, since we first met. Now, Warren and I met probably about 7 years ago at Queensland Writers' Centre. It was in the tea room. And one of us said the word Heidegger, I think, and we just heard the word Heidegger across a crowded room. And ever since then, we've had wonderful conversations. It was so unusual to find another writer who was interested in philosophy and interested in philosophy in everyday life and interested in writing in a creative way about philosophy. And so we've had wonderful conversations since then. And I'm so delighted to be holding this book in my hand. As you can see, I've scribbled all over it. I have a book becomes part of my life. Sorry, I keep moving this away from me. A book becomes part of my life, and yeah, I'm absolutely thrilled. Now, the first thing I want to draw your attention to is the lipstick pink cover on this book. And I actually searched to find something pink to wear, and I can see some pink in the audience. I've noted that a few people have worn pink. And what it marks this book as unique, and yet there are so many other things that also mark this book as unique. I actually went searching to see if I could find another philosophy book that's lipstick pink, and I can't, so it makes it unique anyway. Now, what is so interesting about this book is that if you haven't read it yet, or you don't even have it yet, there's a very, very good description of it on the Avid website. But essentially, he covers 7 philosophers, 7 well-known philosophers. But in addition to that, he covers 250 years of European history. Not only the cultural history from the French Revolution through Napoleon through to the World Wars. He covers the literary and musical traditions in many ways. We meet so many characters like Newton, and we meet Freud, and we meet artists and Wagner, the musician, and yet the book is an intimate discussion of each of these philosophers. He covers an enormous amount of ground, both in the places we visit, and those places are brought vividly to light by your writing, which is beautiful, but also in the ideas. He covers complex ideas, complex philosophical ideas in a way that is very manageable and easy, and you don't feel you're being lectured to. And he does this by introducing us to each philosopher as a human being. a flawed human being, a human being with prejudices and peccadillos and likes and dislikes, and there are some of them that, I really don't like at various points in their life, I have to say. But we really get to see them as a human being, and that's why he does such a good job in this book, and that's why this book is so different from any other book that you'll find about philosophy. Now, to illustrate this, we're going to jump straight in to Warren doing a reading from the book, but first of all, he's going to do a reading from Sartre. I found the book is so lively and engaging. I laughed out loud in quite a few pieces of it, and he's going to do a reading, a short reading, but before he does that, he's going to talk about the beginnings of this deep dive into history and philosophy, and share some of his initial fascination with Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir.
Thank you, Annie, for that delightful introduction. Thank you. I might start with what got me to write the book, because it was when I first read Simone de Beauvoir's She Came to Stay, a couple of decades ago now. And in that book, Simone de Beauvoir describes beautifully Sartre, her lover, and also another young woman who comes into their open relationship, which was a commitment they'd made to each other. And Beauvoir describes her jealousy, her insecurity, the challenges in trying to live this free existentialist life. But she also, what struck me was, and this was the first philosophical book I read, it was a novel, was that she portrays Sartre as her lover, as a man who certainly has plenty of flaws. He's self-centered, he's lustful, she loves him very much, but it's a very difficult and challenging relationship. And that just made me feel, because I didn't study philosophy formally, that I had a way in, and I started to consume books by Sartre and Camus, and moved from their novels to their philosophical works. And later I thought, what if I could gift that to other people, to find a way into philosophy through learning about the lovers of other philosophers? It might be an easy way in, because a lot of philosophical texts are quite daunting. So the reading I'm going to share is when Sartre, as a young man, arrives in Paris from a very unhappy childhood, and it's the first time he starts studying philosophy. He's about 19 years old, and it's the first time he discovers the women. So I'll just give you a few paragraphs of that.
This really gives you a hint of the delightful nature of this book.
So it's called Sexual Awakening. And one thing I've never done is read with a microphone and a book, but I'm going to develop that skill right now. In 1924, the 19-year-old Sartre enrolled in the École Normale Supérieure, an institution that had already nurtured many of France's greatest thinkers and would produce many more. But it wasn't just Sartre's appetite for intellectual stimulation that was gratified at this esteemed institution. The nearby Luxembourg Gardens were a popular gathering place for prostitutes, and Sartre and his classmates took to regularly sampling their services. He didn't, however, have much respect or empathy for these women who provided him and his peers with their first sexual experiences, later recalling that, "We felt that a girl shouldn't give herself like that." The sexism and hypocrisy of these remarks foreshowed an attitude that would later be observed by many women who came in contact with Sartre. In his early 20s, Sartre embarked on his first and last attempt at bourgeois respectability. He became engaged to Germaine Maron, a girl from Lyon. Sartre even approached the engagement in the proper way, asking the girl's parents for her hand in marriage. Germaine's letters to Sartre during this period paint a picture of an effusive but naive girl in love with the idea of being in love. In one of her many long rambling letters to her beau, she declares, "I love you to the point of madness." It would appear that Sartre didn't feel the same as his betrothed, as at the same time he was seeing another young woman who ignited passions his middle-class fiancée could never hope to achieve. This woman's name was Simone, but not to Beauvoir. Simone Jolivet was a flame-haired courtesan who spent her spare time lounging around with Sartre and his classmates, all of whom she titillated to the point of distraction with her outrageous and unashamed sensuality. Sartre was her lover for a few years, but never her client. He wouldn't have been able to afford her services even if he wanted to, She only took on extremely wealthy clients, mainly lawyers and local politicians. The 24-year-old's signature move was to stand naked reading a book in front of a fireplace as the client walked in. As Beauvoir, who later got to know her through Sartre, observed, her cultured mind, her proud bearing, and the subtle technique she brought to her task knocked town clerks and lawyers flat.
Now, we could talk at length about Sartre, but we're not going to because we don't have enough time to talk about all 7 of the philosophers. So I'd like to move from the particular to the broad sweep. I'm just interested, how did you choose these particular philosophers? You've chosen ones that are all very important, but there are other important philosophers that you don't choose. And I'm wondering, were you attracted or interested in them as human beings, or was it their philosophy, or were you trying to, you do a very good job of, you know, the phrase standing on the shoulders of giants. You do a very good job of showing how thinking and philosophy changed over time because it influences these philosophers, but also because of cultural influences. So how did you make that choice, after the first question, and then we'll talk a bit more about your process. Yeah.
Well, when I first started to write the book, I'd never written a book before. I didn't know how to write one. So I just followed my nose, really, and I wrote what I was interested in, is the truth.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good idea if you're writing, follow your nose.
Yeah.
But I'd always sort of regretted that I hadn't gone to university and studied philosophy and understood that history of ideas, and I'd always been fascinated with continental philosophy in particular, because those philosophers are more interested in the arts and the humanities and politics, whereas analytic philosophy is a bit
and they're more
dry.
interested in philosophy in the real world, aren't they?
Exactly,
yes.
And its application.
Yeah.
So what I actually did was Sartre was my entry point, so I wanted to know who was the main influence on him, which was Heidegger.
Yeah.
And to cut a long story short, I went through Wikipedia and just started drawing all these spaghetti maps of all the different influences of visually of all the different philosophers. So I had about 50 philosophers, but there were 7 that seemed to congregate. Sorry, I might be touching them. 7 that, well, I think because I was touching the hand cushion. 7 that just seemed to congregate with lots of lines coming to them and lots of lines leaving them. So they were the 7 most influential.
Yeah.
I do regret that I didn't include more women, which is something, you know, the publishers have asked me about. But I would say that Beauvoir and Arendt get it. You know, there's quite a bit about them. And they come out looking at better than the men anyway.
Well, actually, their philosophy has more relevance than the men, I would argue. Yes, there are a lot more relevance. And I was going to bring up gender, actually, later in the conversation. But I'm interested that in such a grand plan, I'm going to write about these 7 philosophers and 250 years of, you know, philosophy. How did you work out what to put in and what to leave out? There's such an enormous range that you cover, but it never looks heavy-handed.
So that's
what was the process involved in that?
So I handwrote the first draft. I didn't use a computer, and this is 75,000 words long, I think. Yeah. And the first draft was 190,000 words of handwriting, and it was really just me doing a lot of dumping, and a lot of it was philosophy. I mean, I have friends who study philosophy who are very good at making simple things complicated.
Which you do well.
Well, I think I don't. What I hope I do well is to make complicated things appear simple.
Yeah. So, sorry. I meant the other way around. Sorry.
Because I have to understand it myself. Right, but in any case, so there was a lot of philosophy, and there's some of my teachers in the audience, like Kari Gislarson, who actually had a look at some of the first drafts and said, really good if you can break it down into scenes for people. And I learned that at the Queensland Writers Centre. So there's nothing of that 190,000 words in this book. So in a way, that was sort of a layer of helping you just get understand all that philosophy and look at the stories and then to rewrite it. I sort of had a lot of grief when I realised I had to rewrite it, but I'm glad I did because now it's hopefully a readable text.
Well, it's not only readable, it's really engaging because you do transport us to many of those places, and you make, but because you always you cover the whole person's life. In fact, we'll talk in a little while about childhood, but you also, when you do introduce a philosophy, which you cover very coherently, you don't just simplify it totally and, you know, dumb it down, for example. I mean, the fact that you can talk about Derrida blows my mind. He does my head in anything to do with Derrida. But you explain it really, really well. So We might.
I also explained it really, really badly, but I cut those bits out.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So the secret is cutting out 100,000 words.
Cutting is a lot of editing.
Everyone knows that cutting is a huge part of the writing. Now, one thing you bring to this book, which again makes it unique, there are so many reasons this book is unique, is your background as a psychiatrist and as a psychotherapist. And I know there's a lot of discussion about the sexual liaisons and the way the intimate life formed their philosophy. But what fascinated me as much was the information about childhood. I thought I knew a lot about most of these philosophers. I didn't have a clue about any of their childhood. And there seemed to be a thread through it. I'd be interested in your observations on this, where each of them, or so many of them, were the odd one out. They didn't fit in. They were lonely. They were isolated, or they didn't have much nurturing or love. And I'm really interested in what you might have to say about how that perhaps led them to this path to make them more reflective or...
Yeah, well, I think there's two questions there. And, interestingly, when I was starting to write the book, I saw it as a break from psychiatry.
Okay.
Of course, unconsciously, I realise now I was doing what I do as a psychiatrist, which is the patient comes into my room, I see them, they see me for therapy, and I'm interested in how their childhood has shaped the way they see the world, they see other people. And all these philosophers see the world in a fresh, new, interesting way.
Yeah.
And so I was interested in how their childhood, which is that first love relationship, may have shaped the way they see the world. But I think Sartre helps to answer your second question, because he himself in his memoir, Words, said that he was glad his father died early. He was a pretty cold man, Sartre, because it meant he could create his own world, and otherwise he would need to follow what his father wanted him to do. And one of their fathers died early, and I think they had to create their own fatherland in their mind. Something that struck me as well.
I was very, very interested. I mean, some of them are very, very sad. Derrida, for example, he was Algerian. And how do you describe him? A small, black, Jewish boy. He was always very much the outsider, wasn't he?
Yeah, a lot of them had the outsider experience, didn't they? And Derrida grew up in Algeria.
Yes.
And he really, he was Jewish, and he spoke French and lived side by side with Muslims and Berbers, the indigenous people. And so from an early, and his parents, just to help his identity crisis, decided they were going to call him an American name. They called him Jackie, after Jackie Chan films. And so what I talk about in the book is how he just grew up with a very fractured identity and realising that labels can really shape your identity. And when he went to France, he changed his name to Jacques, Jacques Derrida, and became French, as it were. But he was aware how words construct your identity, and that's a big part of his own philosophy, how words create reality.
And the fact that fractured identity, I mean, he was talking about structuralism or post-structuralism, that meaning is very fluid and flexible. I was just fascinated with so many of the links between childhood and the sort of philosophy that they ended up talking about. It's just amazing. I just felt I learned so much. Now, I'm really interested in talking about gender because it's about a year since the Women's March to Canberra. It's a very important time for us, and as a 70s feminist myself, a lot of the, you talk about the women a lot, which is fabulous, and also the fact of the intellectual engagement that many of the philosophers had with women in their life. It wasn't purely sexual. But a lot of the behaviour jumps out as so misogynistic. I found it quite difficult to read. And I wonder, and you do mention that, I wonder how you felt dealing with that and writing about that.
Well, as you say, the book tracks from 1780 through to 2014. And so I was really interested in how you could see feminism emerging, first as just a little trickle, but then it ends up with Derrida having an affair with a feminist scholar, and he demands she has an abortion, and I don't want to give any spoilers away, but he, in a way, his tail's between his legs at the end of that encounter. But if we go back to Kant, he was in love with a woman who was actually much higher station than him, and she had more power. So there was sort of like personal differences. But what I could see is the impact of feminism in a good way coming into philosophy. Because one way to look at Western philosophy is it's dead white men trying to separate their minds from their bodies.
Yes.
And I hope what I show in this is that's not really possible.
Yes, that's right.
And certainly they learn over and over that these men who are trying to do this from all the way back from Aristotle. It's probably a doomed exercise. And I think as we're getting more women and also, non-Western philosophies, there's more context, there's more relationship with the planet, there's more relationship with bodies and sexuality. So I think that's a good element in philosophy, which is after this in a way.
Well, I mean, one question I was going to ask, because you do track philosophy through from that whole thing about is it about reason or is it about feeling, sense and sensibility, and then you go through phenomenology, which is the study of experience, through postmodernism, where meaning is such a fluid, flexible thing. And I was going to ask the question, what do you see as where philosophy is going, which I suppose you've answered to a large extent there.
Well, if analytic philosophy, which is still dominant in British and American universities, it's still very much about the mind. It's about logic, and it's sort of decontextualised and it's not historicised. But I think Nietzsche was one of the first when he wrote Birth of Tragedy, and his theme in that was that the whole history of philosophy, we've lost our way because it's all about the mental rather than the physical, and sexuality and ecstasy and dance. And so he uncovered some ancient Greek texts that he said that we've suppressed our bodies. And then I think...
That was great.
And so I think he was onto something there, which later philosophers have picked up. And of course Beauvoir, in The Second Sex, wrote about one is not born a woman, one becomes a woman.
That's right.
And that was a great work of philosophy as well as feminism. It just describes why, about the patriarchy that's still influencing all of us today.
Well, yes, I mean, I was very interested because I'm very fond of Hannah Arendt and Simone de Beauvoir, particularly fond of their philosophy and their mixed relationship. They obviously loved their partners, but also felt quite ambivalent about it. And it's interesting, Simone de Beauvoir, The Second Sex, is there's a new translation out. The first translation into English, a lot of the phenomenology was left out. And I was just reading not long ago this phrase of hers where she says, first a woman's wings are clipped and then she is blamed for not knowing how to fly. It's just, there was sort of this ambivalence, because that was one of her later works, wasn't it? Yeah. This ambivalence about Sartre, who she adored, but yes, there was. And
for all Sartre's shortcomings, it was him that suggested she wrote a book about what it's like to be a woman.
Yes.
And when she wrote it, she had rape and death threats. And she couldn't walk out in the street because she was talking about lesbianism, abortion, contraception, and she did feel that he stood beside her. In a lot of ways, he was interesting. Person in the way he treated women, but their friendship did seem to be a very strong bond, didn't it?
Exactly. Yeah, the same with Hannah Arendt, as you say. So, what do you? I'm very interested in. Everyone learns something when they write. All writers know that you learn something through writing. And through this entire process of writing, did you learn something particular about philosophy that stuck with you? Any gems of philosophy that you thought really apply to me or really apply to life? Many. But I think, what the existentialists from Nietzsche onwards said, I think it's so much in the ether that we just assume it now. But there was a time for about 1,000 years when we just all did what the priest said, and Nietzsche said God is dead. So if religion, we can't believe in it anymore, for me personally, what is the purpose of my life? What am I here? Where's the guidebook? And so I love the philosophers. I think the genuine ones like Heidegger, Sartre, and Beauvoir and others, and Arendt are looking at trying to answer that question. Without God or
a parent. How do we create meaning in our life? And that's something that still interests me.
Well, certainly, speaking about Heidegger, you've got a really interesting story to tell about Heidegger, which you tell in the book. Would you be interested in telling it now?
Yes, so there's the book. I mean, it's about following your nose. So I was sort of halfway through the book, writing the book, and there was a philosophy and psychiatry special interest group in Brisbane, which was about 6 years ago. And I thought, I'd love to go to that. You know, I'm a psychiatrist, I'm interested in philosophy. And it turned up, there were about 5 people there. And I thought on the way, don't tell anyone you're writing a book. Someone who's writing, other creative people said, if you're in a creative process, you shouldn't share it. So I went in there saying to me, don't talk about the book, don't talk about the book, don't talk about the book. And the first person I met was a lovely guy called Martin. I don't know, he's probably in the audience here. Psychiatrist, and he was actually from, I said, oh, where are you from? I haven't met you before. He said, I'm actually from Freiburg in Germany. And I said, oh, I'm writing a book about Martin Heidegger, and he's from Freiburg. And he said, yeah, my mum knows his son. I said, are you serious? How old is his son? He said, 95 years old. And I said, do you think there's any chance I could go to Freiburg and talk with him? He said, I think maybe you could, yeah. So he got in touch with his mum. 2 weeks later, I'm on a plane heading to Freiburg, this lovely little university town. And I was there for about a week before I could meet with Mr. Heidegger. And I was quite nervous, actually. And I thought, what will I wear? You know? And I thought, I'll wear a suit. In Europe, a suit is always a good thing to wear, even though I don't normally wear a suit. And just the night before, I'd been doing research into the 95-year-old son of Martin as well. And I came across some letters that had just been released that showed that actually he wasn't the biological son of Martin Heidegger, who is one of the most esteemed philosophers of the 20th century.
He certainly is, yes.
Yeah, that his wife had an affair with an old childhood sweetheart while he was off with his girl doing research. So I arrived there to meet this lovely 95-year-old, well, I found him lovely, 95-year-old man, very white hair, big boned fellow with his lovely wife Jutta. They're in a little house on the outskirts of Freiburg. And I went in there with the interpreter that I paid for and sat down in the lounge room, turned on the recorder, and I said to him, so what would you like to talk about, to tell me about your father? And he looked at me and his lips started to drop. And his face went very white, and he said, do you know who I am? I thought, shit. I've come a long way. And then the psychotherapist in me just clicked in and I thought, I think I know how to answer this. And I answered it by talking about 2 truths that were opposite, something to do with a psychotherapist. And I said, I know that you were not Martin's biological son. And I know he was your father and he raised you all his life. And you're his son. And he looked so relieved and looked at his wife. And, yeah, me too, as I remember it. And he was just so happy to proceed and tell us about his life, which was quite amazing, including when he was 10 years old, he and his brother Jürg, the mother, who was actually quite excited about Mein Kampf, which has just been written, took them to a rally of 50,000 people in Freiburg Stadium where they saw Hitler speak. That sort of sent a shiver down my spine. And he said, my father wasn't really very interested in Hitler. He was more interested in the ancient Greeks and wouldn't come to the rally. Anyway, it's just not, because there's lots of scholarly stuff about whether Heidegger was a Nazi or not, but it's just interesting to hear the family's perspective.
I remember when I first met you and we had the first discussion on Heidegger, you just happened to drop in, and I've met Heidegger's son. I was so impressed.
I said to my best friend the other day, that was the best night of my life. And I was sitting next to my daughter, and he said, did you see what your father said? Yeah, one of my daughters. But anyway, I was pretty excited.
I think I would have kicked you if your wife. Yes, I mean, you only talk about that tiny bit in the book, but there are so many background stories, of course, to every book, and because you cover so much, there's so many other lovely stories. One of the other interesting philosophers you talk, well, they're all interesting, I must admit, not just their philosophy, but some of those lives are just quite fascinating, but is Foucault. We haven't really spoken about Foucault tonight. Now, Foucault really broke the boundaries. I think the chapter titles really give a wonderful little summary of one of the key points of each philosopher's life. And I think it's titled Sexual something or other, Sexual Liberation.
The whole chapter, I think, A History of Sexuality.
Yeah, or something like that. Anyway.
Which was one of his texts.
Exactly.
But it's the history of his sexuality in this book.
Yeah. And he was one who pointed out after Sartre, talking about freedom of choice, that we don't do what God tells us to do, we have to make our own choices. He was the one who pointed out that the structures in society actually have far more power and control over the way that we see the world and the way we think about and the choices that we are free to make, which was quite a huge breakthrough. And in his own life, he was a homosexual, and that was very much in the stage where, perhaps you can tell us more about that, how he explored for example, he ends up in the gay scene in San Francisco in the book.
Yeah. So, I think that's fascinating. I mean, in a way, I would naturally think like an existentialist, like Sartre, who's a humanist, which says that, we're all individuals and we make free choices. But at Sartre's funeral, and there were 50,000 people at that funeral too, so...
he was quite a star.
Yeah, he was a star in 1984. But Foucault was at the funeral and he turned to his students at the time and said, as they were putting the coffin down, this is the man that I've always wanted to just overcome and destroy his philosophy. Nice fellow. But anyway, but then so he went on to talk about structuralism, that really what we think are our original ideas and thoughts and feelings are constructed, as you put it so nicely.
Yes.
But what I try to do in the book is to look at how his biography helped him to maybe think that, because he went to the École Normale Supérieure too, and when he arrived there in the late 50s, I think it was, or early 60s, he was going out to beats, trying to get his sexual needs met as a young man. And even though there was a lot of tolerance of Trotskyism in that university and Marxism and maybe not so much feminism, but homosexuality wasn't very well tolerated.
That's right, yes.
And he was found in his room at 20 with razor marks all over his chest, and he attempted suicide. And his father, who was a surgeon, who he didn't like his father, but his father got a psychiatrist for him. Yes. And the psychiatrist diagnosed homosexuality and offered a range of treatments, and Foucault escaped that, fortunately, and then wrote a brilliant book called Madness and Civilization, which was all about how mental illness can be often constructed by those in power using language to support that power. And Foucault is still the most cited thinker in literature, more than any other literature, other than Einstein, Marx, Freud. His ideas have really been very helpful for lots of discourse, haven't they?
They have, yes, particularly in cultural discourse, because now we're very aware of power structures, and that's really changed the way a lot of people think. But not many people know about Foucault. That's just it. He's not one of the really famous names if you don't work in the philosophy area, and yet he had this huge impact. And again, as you say, coming from the start. And what he did with the Madness and Civilization was to look at, we call it a historiography.
Yeah, so the analysis of history, I didn't get to the gay scholars in California, but we can go there.
Oh, yeah, okay. Well, I must admit, the gay scene in California, he died of AIDS, sadly, which is...
I actually took this book down to try and plug it in a queer bookstore in King's Cross a couple of weeks ago, and I told them, I had Foucault and all about the gay saunas, and the bookstore said, did you do lots of research? And I said, not that much, but...
Well, that was another section of the book that was... when he talked about California, San Francisco at that time, and... his shopping list, as I recall, whips and leather outfits.
Nipple clamps.
Nipple clamps, that's right. So, yes, I remember the nipple clamps.
It was interesting doing the research.
Yes. It was.
And Foucault was very interested in what he called limit experiences, which to have sadomasochistic sex, often in a group setting, until
That's right.
and would sort of try and break beyond the self. And he also took LSD and other drugs to try and get beyond the self, because that was his whole project in a way.
Yeah. So there are many, many fascinating people like that. How are we going for time? Oh, good. We've still got plenty of time. Yeah. Okay, 5? Right, okay. I'd really like to know what you learned about yourself in writing this book. Feel free not to answer, I mean, but...
Not really into nipple clamps. No, more seriously, what I enjoy is I love writing.
Yeah.
And actually especially love the research, and Chrissy and I have talked a lot about writing and see her nodding, but just following your sort of obsessions.
Yeah.
And I just plan to keep doing that. And if people want to read it, that's a plus. But the joy of actually just following your nose to something just fascinating. I can see Ben, my friend in the audience, is following it, one of his obsessions at the moment with reading. But reading leads to writing and then researching, interviewing, just see where it takes you.
Yeah.
And that's what I love. Yeah. Sorry.
I was going to say, do you want to give us some little hint? I know you're writing a book. Do you want to mention it or too soon? Or
Yeah, look,
it's just that we're talking about gender.
I'm happy to mention it because I've been working on it for quite a while. But I mean, because a couple of people said, why didn't you include any women? And I think that's a fair question. I felt rather ashamed, to be honest. So my next book is about 7 women who hosted salons in Europe. And it's similar in that it's got my favourite number in it, 7.
Yep, I know a similarity.
But it's about, it also tracks feminism really as women from the Renaissance through to the current day, hosting gatherings in their home, circles of writers and intellectuals. So it's an intellectual history, but with women at the centre. Yeah.
I'm really looking forward to that. What colour cover do you reckon?
I don't know yet. Publishers decide that.
But you decided this one, didn't you?
Not the colour of no. My one of my daughters, Bella Tobin.
Yes, that's
she designed the pictures, which I'm really, really happy with.
It's beautiful, isn't it? Yes. The way it's got the watercolours through there. Now, will we start to take questions?
We have so many questions.
Yeah, okay. All right, we'll move over to questions. I could talk to you for a minute.
Thanks, Sarah.
We will move on to questions now, and I think the book after that should be 7 non-binary and trans thinkers that have changed the world. So next up, so we have a few questions on Zoom. I'll ask one of them. We'll go to the audience, and then we'll go back and forth between Zoom because you've got quite a lot. Viv has said, is there something that you detected in French culture that has produced so many great philosophers?
Good question, Viv.
That's a great question. Look, for research, I had to go to Paris many times, of course. The thing that struck me was that everywhere I turned, there were bookstores, and there were just reams and reams on philosophy, and people were sitting there reading it all day. And, just talking to my German friend too, I think it's similar in Germany, everyone studies philosophy, whereas I didn't really at school or uni. So I think it's in the ether. But France also seems to have this tradition of, especially men who have a bit of a, mystification around them, where they sort of set themselves up, I think, to be grand public intellectuals, and some of it's bravado and some of it's earned, I think, but it's just an interesting, we don't have many public intellectuals in Australia. I notice when I walk around Brisbane, I see many statues of football players, and I love football, but,
not so many public intellectuals in
not so many.
the stone statue.
We seem to have a shortage.
That's true. It's true. A question from the audience here. Anyone here have a question? We can go straight to Zoom if you want to have a minute to think. Actually, I'll go to another Zoom question, so all have a think if you've got any questions. A Zoom question is, some of the philosophers described in the book as gifted speakers, particularly Heidegger and Foucault, do any recordings exist of their voices speaking?
This is something that Anni might be able to answer better, actually.
I think there is some of Heidegger, but I'm not sure about that.
I haven't come across them in my research, so I don't know the answer really. But
he was famous for his his Heidegger was famous for his lecture. People came from all over Europe for that. I thought there was something, but I really don't know the actual answer.
Great question.
I've heard Simone de Beauvoir's a recording of her somewhere on the internet, but
and then Hannah. I'm sure.
Yeah, which I think because you get a sense of the embodiedness of the voice. Then,
yeah.
This is a good question. Anyone in the audience now? Yes.
How did you choose the time frame? Why was it a couple of 100 years, or was there an event at the end of that culminated, or was it just that was just the time period where you felt that you knew the most about?
How did you choose the time frame is the question.
Yeah, thank you, Sue, my sister. No, good question. Really, because that's when the Enlightenment began, and when Kant, you first started to wonder whether we could have, for example, Kant spoke about an ethical system that didn't need to involve God. So it was when that sort of departure from religious thinking, following authority, to free thinking. I thought about studying with Descartes, because you could argue with his skeptical thinking, but that would be more than 7 then.
Any other questions to the audience? Yes.
In terms of your work in psychiatry, does it change your practice?
Question is, does your work in psychiatry change your writing practice? Oh, the other way around. Does your philosophy change your psychiatry practice?
That's a great question. So actually writing a book changed my psychotherapy practice considerably, because what I found was that I could edit stories and change them. So even though it's non-fiction, we all make selections about which part of the story we're going to tell, the one that seems truest to us maybe, because even in fiction we try to write the truth, I think. And so I have a lot of patients who've suffered severe trauma who have a story about themselves, and that story is that, they're bad, they're damaged, they're ashamed. And this idea that they can edit their story became much clearer to me, that these words, thoughts, beliefs we have, they can all be reviewed. So thank you for that question.
A question online from Gail. You've made Derrida simple to me, which is a big call, but it was successful. How do you do that, simplifying these big ideas?
Trying to simplify Derrida was like trying to wrestle a crocodile. I was very daunted. I think I just kept reading it until bits made sense to me, and then they're the bits that I use as kernels in the book, especially when there's metaphor. I won't go into the metaphor I do about orange and oranges, but I think if you can paint a picture so people can see it, that makes it easier. And of course, I read a lot of secondary literature where really gifted scholars and thinkers try to get to the heart of what Derrida and other thinkers were. And a lot of them I bought from the Added bookstore, I must say. Lots of great philosophy books. A lot of those simple guides are really, really actually very helpful.
The little spinner of the simple kind of graphic guides are useful.
Yeah.
Anybody else have a question from the audience here? No? We do have a little bit more time if anyone on Zoom also has questions. We've had a question about what you're doing next, which you really did cover. Are you doing any, you've done a lot of travel for your first book, and we've had a couple of years hiatus. Is that back on the agenda now that things are opening up a bit? Yeah, no,
I do need to do some travel to research, especially George Sand's life at the moment. So I'm having to go to her house, a couple of hours out. I've been playing there for 2 or 3 years, so I'm itching to get back on the trail. But if we are just coming to the end, there are some thank yous I'd like to do, if that's okay, Chrissy, or should that be?
Yeah, can we just do one more question?
Yes.
The question from Zoom is, when did you start to develop an interest in writing?
Pretty well in 2009 in October, when I was sitting in a bath, literally, and
That's like Archimedes.
I know, it was like that. And a flash came to me. I was just imagining the lives of Sartre and Beauvoir in Paris, and the flash came to me. It was like this, and I went into what Jung would call this active imagination, where I had this fantasy for an hour of imagining the streets of Paris. I could see the light on the cobblestones. I'm not kidding. And I went to Zoe, my partner, and said, and wrote down about 10 pages. I think I'm going to write a book. And so I didn't plan to write. I just planned to write this book, and then got the bug, really.
Fantastic. Oh, well, I'm really incredibly glad that you did get the bug. I think there is one more Zoom question. Is there any other questions in the audience? Yes, Cass.
Warren, I just think you've achieved what you've achieved in producing something comprehensible from a really complex subject is amazing. The fact that you made it so engaging. This is very similar to the other Zoom question, but I wanted to know for the writers amongst us, what are your 3 top tips for taking a non-fiction subject and making it really engaging and compelling for a reader who may not know anything about that subject?
So the question is the 3 top tips of making a subject engaging, taking a non-fiction subject.
Yeah, and I think the question was especially how to make non-fiction engaging. The truth is I went to a lot of fiction writing workshops at the Queensland Writers' Centre, at Avid, at writers' festivals, because they're, and most of my writing friends are fiction writers, and so it's all about how to create scenes, how to have dramatic arcs, using dialogue. But as a non-fiction writer, I use letters mainly, and they can be used as a purpose of dialogue. So I think, I have to thank the fiction writers like you, Cass, for that.
Excellent. There's a question from Zoom, which is there any reason why you did not choose Claude Levi-Strauss, but you did choose Derrida and Foucault all about the same time? So I suppose that's a question not just specifically about that, but how did you work it that you were going to do these 7?
Yeah, I tried to sort of answer that earlier. It's basically my big spaghetti diagram where I drew the influences of a whole lot of people, including Levi-Strauss. And I actually ended up with 9 thinkers who were really had lots of arrows going towards them and out of them. And 2 of those were Freud and Marx. But I'd already sort of studied a fair bit about Freud and Marx, and I wanted to learn about the other 7. And you could argue Freud and Marx do something that's separate to philosophy, maybe.
Yeah. And Freud and Marx make it into the book.
Yeah, they're in there. Yeah, in passing.
That's great. I think we can move on to the thank yous now, actually.
Yeah, so the first person I'd like to thank is Chrissy Mean, who a few years ago I went to her and said, I can't get a publisher for this book. Should I just give up? And Chrissy's been there for several years. She would never ever mention this because she's so humble, but she's actually been holding my hand as a writer mentor for quite a few years, and I'm really grateful, Chrissy. And also to Fiona Stager and everybody at Avid, who've been really supportive of me and so many other writers. We're just so lucky in Brisbane to have Avid Reader. It really nurtures emerging writers. And, I seem maybe confident speaking now, but I had a lot of nervous salons where you brought me to share my reading. So thanks for that. I'd like to thank my writing critique family, the Dead Darlings Society. You want to put your hand up there? Yes. So one of the greatest writing critique groups in Brisbane. Yes. And Fiona Robertson had her launch here just a couple of weeks ago, and we've been chipping away for about 7 years. There's also a group called the Book Gang, which is I won't name them all because I'll forget somebody. There's so many of us, but they're a group of authors who are having their debuts in 2022, including Danuka Mackenzie, who's up soon, I think. Yeah, very soon.
Online too.
Yeah. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming tonight on just such a crazy, crazy night, because I heard it was sold out, then I thought it was washed out. I'd particularly like to thank my family, my beautiful partner Zoe, who's normally very honest and critical, and when I showed her the first few pages, she said, that's actually all right. And Zoe says that it means...
such an expert.
And also Alex and Dom, my daughters, who've come a long way to be here, who put up with 10 years of coming to my office saying, oh, Dad, can I just talk to you about something? And me...
Writing.
Yes, and I would say writing. I've probably forgotten people, but yeah, thanks everyone who's helped me on the journey.
Fantastic.
And Annie, of course, who's You're a great friend in philosophy and writing, so well done. Thank you, Annie.
Look, it has been fascinating and enlightening kind of teaser for your time with the book that you will spend with the actual physical book. But now we're going to go to the next bit of the event, which is the most fun bit of the event for the author, which is the book signing. And because we're battling the weather tonight, we're going to have to do the signing inside. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to come and sweep the table away and move it down towards that front door so that it's easier to for people to line up and also to purchase the book at the counter. So to make this all happen smoothly, what we're going to do when you stand up is if you're on a folding up chair, if you can fold it and lean it against the